Hello everyone, welcome to our final video lecture of the term. Today we're going to finish off Waluchow's Constitutions as Living Trees and Idiot Defends. Rather than spend time giving a synopsis of what we've already done, we're just going to pick up with the piece here, moving into section 7, because I think section 7 is really a nice point to think about what's already come before. And of course, now that we're in this video format, you can always go back and you can watch the tail end of the previous video or the start of it or what have you right before you watch this. So I don't think a lengthy recap is really necessary. So in this debate about should we have certain rights enshrined or really entrenched is the language Waldron favors at the constitutional level in something like a written Bill of Rights or a written charter, Waluchow ultimately is going to argue yes. Why? Well, he thinks we need to reconceptualize what charters are really like, adopt this living tree conception where they are really like a piece of the common law that are important, they help guide precedent and so on, but they can be amended, they can be changed over time. They are not absolute fixed points. So what kind of advantages do we get from that kind of document? What are the advantages of having a written charter or having certain rights entrenched at all? Well, of course, we get precisely protection of minority rights, as Waluchow puts it, against the majoritarian biases and excesses of democratic legislatures. So here again, we could just think back to Mill and the tyranny of the majority. Whenever we have a democracy that's making decisions based on something like a majority vote, there's always the threat that minorities, whatever those are, so you can, of course, think about minorities saying religious or racial terms, but they need not be so. They can be construed in other ways as well, are always minorities, whatever makes up a minority at any given time, are going to be, in some sense, at the mercy of the whims of the legislature. And just as a realistic point, there are going to be biases and misjudgments and self-interested reasoning at times. So charters are there to offer protection of certain rights, and they do it by implementing a kind of pre-commitment strategy. And of course, we heard Waldron really arguing against this sort of thing before, and Waluchow is really going to engage with that more now. In short, Waldron's argument against the pre-commitment strategy is that really this is the dead hand of the past objection. You're allowing the majority views from some earlier time have more of a say than current majority views. And that's not really democratic. So goes the objection. But Waluchow argues that really charters are a form of pre-commitment strategy, and it's sensible to have that kind of pre-commitment strategy, in part because he characterizes what charters are and the role they play and what they really express in a way that's different than Waldron does. So Waldron says having a charter like that, or a Bill of Rights, really anything entrenching rights in a way, is a mixture of self-confidence, certainty that we've gotten things right, we know which rights should be in there, and mistrust, that you don't think in the future your fellow citizens are going to have that same realization you do about which rights are the ones that we should really protect. So Waluchow says really, if we have this living tree conception of a charter, this common law conception, we could sort of tease those apart and say there's something a little bit different from the living tree idea than there is from a common law conception, but really I'm running these together, and that's effectively what Waluchow is doing too, saying a living tree charter is really one that is based on a common law conception, that it acts as this kind of important precedent that can be changed over time, but needs to be generally respected in other sorts of decisions and other sorts of laws. So having that living tree conception of a charter lets us see how conventional understandings or the customs of a community do actually inform the interpretation and application of those sorts of charters. So there is still this question of community standard that's being involved. When we're dealing with the common law, one of the sources of common law is really community standard or conventional understanding. The way in which things are typically done in a given society itself acts as a kind of, I hesitate to say precedent exactly, but it is a source of law, something that's taken into consideration when judges in a common law environment are deliberating about something. Now, of course, it itself is in some ways a little bit less weighty than actual statute or precedents that are there, but it often helps inform both of those things. The way things are done and the way people as a whole want things done is something that informs statutes, pieces of legislation, right? Presumably the majority and the sorts of ways they do things informs how they vote, and that informs how legislators produce new laws on the basis of their powers. It also helps inform judges' decisions when they're exercising their discretion and thinking about a particular case. What does this right mean in practice, or how should this law be applied? They're going to be thinking about, well, how do people normally do these sorts of things? How are these sorts of behaviors typically governed by community practice? Now, these living tree charters, rather than displaying attitudes of self-confidence and mistrust, Waluchow thinks really instead they send a very different sort of message. They send the message that here are our strongest commitments right now when it comes to moral matters and political and legal matters. What charters do is really embody our firmest convictions at a given time, along with a humble attitude that in fact maybe we didn't get everything right, which is precisely why a living tree charter is open to revision over time. It can be amended through various processes, but it's also one element of judicial reasoning. So when judges are thinking about how they should decide various cases, something like a charter and the rights it has are taken very seriously. They're taken to be very weighty. But that doesn't mean that what's written in the charter necessarily is going to produce some one outcome. So we can still be actually humble rather than self-confident and mistrustful in admitting that we're fallible. We haven't thought everything through. We don't know all the truths there are to know about rights and politics and law and ethics. But they act as a kind of expression of our deepest commitments when they are put in place. And as long as we abide by it and don't seek to revise what's going on there, they serve as a kind of symbolic representation of those commitments, a point we're going to come back to in a little bit. Now, on page 310, Waluchow contrasts what he calls the humble message, which is really his way of representing what it is a charter is standing for, with the, I think he calls it the hubristic message. Yes, the hubristic message, which would be the way Waldron wants to construe what a charter really represents. So I think that's worth taking a look at. I'm not going to talk through it here. You can take a look. But really, these are the two ways of thinking about what charters really represent. Waluchow thinks that Waldron's wrong in thinking the charter necessarily represents the hubristic message. That's what it carries with it. Now, don't we still have this dead hand of the past objection? Right? Isn't it still the case that by having a written charter that's entrenching certain rights, we're giving the majority views from the past greater weight than the majority views of the present? There's really three responses Waluchow offers. We've already seen them to some degree, but he articulates them here, so it's worth just bringing them up clearly. First, charters can be amended. It's difficult to do so, almost by definition, if it's just as easy to change a charter as it is to change any other piece of legislation. You probably don't really have a charter on your hands, but these things can be amended. If it turns out that there's parts in there that we collectively come to think are just wrong and they're obviously problematic and so on, we can change them. So we are not, in a sense, anchored or held down by the past in a way that we can't do anything about. Second, there's seldom serious disagreement over the legitimacy of the rights actually included in a given charter. Now, of course, there might be disagreement, even widespread disagreement over what certain rights mean in practice. There might be some disagreement over how charters should be worded or how certain rights should be included or not within them. But just as a matter of fact, Waluchow thinks the rights that are actually included in them tend to be fairly widely accepted and supported. And he gives just, for instance, rights of equality, freedom of expression, due process, or fundamental justice. He says, who really disagrees with that? Where are the people out there saying, no, we shouldn't have equality. That's not something that should be in there. No, we shouldn't have freedom of expression. No, you shouldn't have due process before the law. And he says, in fact, there are certain fundamental rights that are very widely agreed upon in democracies and liberal societies all over the world. So yes, there can be disagreement about what goes into a charter and how it should be read and applied, but he just denies that there's really serious disagreement, such widespread serious disagreement, that we can't actually, as a society, come to some sort of agreement on at least the basic commitments we have. Third, though precedent is always to some extent constraining on future decision makers, the usual common law powers of avoidance are always available. What does Waluchow have in mind there? Well, he just has in mind the usual things judges can do when faced with a precedent and then a situation where that precedent produces a very bad result. They can either distinguish between the cases. So they can say, look, this current case, although it seems relevantly similar to that previous case, and thus it seems like the precedent from the previous case should apply to this one. In fact, there's some kind of relevant difference. And because of the relevant difference, really we don't have a new version of the same case on our hands. We have a different sort of case characterized by these sorts of features. And in this sort of case characterized by these sorts of features, really some other precedent should apply. So judges can distinguish in that kind of way. They can also strike down a previous precedent if it just seems like over time we've really come to the view that it's not the right decision ultimately. That's in practice doesn't happen an awful lot. Generally, stare decisis means that past precedents are going to be upheld and applied in future cases, in part just to keep the justice system being stable, that we know what to expect when a judge is ruling on a particular sort of case. So we have precedent coming out of something like a charter, and in some sense that's the dead hand of the past. But it's not like in a common law system, this dead hand of the past in the form of precedent means that there's absolutely no discretion at all, that judges have no power to make new decisions, that changing understandings of morality and politics and law within a society mean that there can be no changes whatsoever. We can still have those changes, but what we have is this constraint in the form of some sort of precedent helping to guide things and make transitions in the domain of law be relatively slow. Now, is that always a good thing? It's not always a good thing, but this comes back to something that Waluchow was thinking about in the first part of this paper, which are the really two desiderata of a legal society that Hart was talking about, which is the need to balance fixity or stability and predictability with flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing times and circumstances and understandings of how we really should organize ourselves. So Waluchow thinks, do we have the dead hand of the past here in the form of a charter? Well, in some ways, yes, but that's not always a bad thing, right? It helps guide what we're doing in some sense. And in particular, we keep number 2 in mind, that there's really not that much serious disagreement over at least the basic rights that are put into a charter. It's not always such a bad thing to have the dead hand of the past having some kind of say. Just like in other cases where there's precedent, it at least, and Waluchow makes this point in the paper, it at least makes a judge or somebody else that is thinking about doing something different than what was done in the past, it at least makes them think twice, right? If they look at what was done in the past and they see some sort of precedent decision or they see something in a charter that at first disagrees with what they're doing and they think, oh, well, that's not what I'm doing here, they at least have to stop and think, am I really correct? Is there maybe something I've missed? Why would they have done it differently in the past? Are those reasons good reasons that still apply these days? Or in fact, if things just changed for the better and that we really know better than people used to about how we should handle these sorts of situations? Say whether or not equal protection should be extended to women or minority groups or something like that. So Waluchow thinks, sure, you have the dead hand of the past to some extent, but it's not always problematic. There can be certain benefits to having that. And in fact, it's not as restrictive as Waldron makes it out to be. So we aren't really disadvantaged in some serious way by having a written charter. Now, this comes around to Waluchow thinks really there's a couple of good reasons to adopt a written charter. Although a democracy is more flexible when it doesn't have one, and this is really Waldron's case, right? If a majoritarian democracy doesn't have a charter, then whatever the majority at a given time thinks is right is what they're going to do. So sure, a democracy is more flexible without a charter, so why have one at all? Well, first point, which I already mentioned on the previous slide, which Waluchow is really pulling from heart, is that there's this balance to be struck between flexibility and fixity. So, you know, adaptability and stability or predictability. We have to find the right balance there. We can overdo it in either direction. Not having a written charter is really to favor flexibility over fixity. And so you might actually have quite wild swings in rights over relatively short periods of time, depending on how votes go, how legislatures get made up, and so on. And of course, this is something Waluchow does talk about, and we're going to get around to, but I'm going to mention here, when you have a representative democracy like you do in Canada or the United States or most, okay, I can't actually think of a direct democracy that's still functioning in the world. So representative democracy is where the people get together, they then vote for representatives, their representatives then go to represent their interests in the legislature or whatever exactly the law-making body is in the land. So instead of you and me and all other Canadians directly voting on, say, pieces of legislation or, you know, what we think should be done, instead we vote just for our representatives, and our representatives vote on our behalf. Well, when you have that kind of system, in fact, people have a rather limited say on direct matters. So you might vote for a particular party on, say, a provincial or a federal election. Now, of course, you get one vote, and you get to pick, you know, amongst, say, the major parties or minor parties. You can vote for the Conservatives or the Liberals or the NDP, or if there's somebody standing for it in your area, you know, the Bloc Québécois or Green Party, or, you know, the Marxist-Leninist Party or the Hippopotamus Party or whatever it is. But you get one choice, possibly over the course of several years. You get, say, once. And you might have a particular view on what sorts of rights and what kinds of pieces of legislation should be passed on different particular issues. But you might, on the whole, vote for a party that aligns best with your views. That said, what the party decides to do in some particular area concerning rights might not be something that, in fact, even most of the people who vote for them think is correct. So based on representative democracy, you can have the people's representatives within the legislature passing pieces of legislation that, in fact, are not representative of the majority views of the people that they're representing. But given that people only get the chance to really express themselves in that strong way through their vote once every X many years, quite often, and when they get to do that, they're voting in an all things considered way, you actually, in some sense, start losing some of the representativeness in the democracy, right? The majority of views of the people within a given community might not actually be represented in all issues. Okay, let's set that aside for a little bit, just come back to really what Waluchow is saying explicitly here. So having a charter really strikes the right balance, whereas not having one is to favor flexibility over fixity. The contents of a charter are also fairly well known. It's much easier to access, say, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms than it is to access the array of unwritten rules and conventions involved in the application of law. So how does the common law system in Canada work? What sorts of unwritten rules and conventions go into how lawyers make arguments, how pieces of evidence are presented, how judgments are done, how precedents are interpreted, right? There's so many practical questions we could articulate here. Now, as I said at the start of term, there's a course in the philosophy of law. This is not law school. There are these things called law schools where you go to actually learn a whole bunch of these things. And they cost an awful lot of money and take a lot of time and energy to get through. So if you actually want to know how the law works in practice, well, that's tough, right? It's difficult. It's just not the sort of thing that everybody in a given society will actually have the time and energy to figure out. And this is something that came up in Hart when he was talking as well about the professionalization of law. We have people who actually are dedicated to how these things work and can make that sort of system function in a way that not necessarily everybody in a society even understands, but so long as it's working well or well enough, it still can be accepted as legitimate within a given society. Now that said, the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, if I'm remembering correctly, even as a school child, that was posted up in classrooms, right? You can go look at it. It's not that long of a document. Today with the internet, it's very easy to access that charter, or say the United States Constitution and the Bill of Rights, or think whatever liberal democracy you want. If it has some sort of constitutional document, it has something like a charter, it's pretty easy to go find it, read through it, and get a sense of really what are the basic important points underlying that political and legal system, right? Gives you a sense of what they're committed to overall. And in fact, this is really Waluchow's second point. Charters have a symbolic value, which he thinks is often underplayed, right? It's often underappreciated, that symbolic value they have. As he puts it, charters help define and reinforce the character of the nation as one publicly committed in its legal and moral practices to the fundamental rights and values it includes. So by having things written down in a charter like that, it's a way of a society coming out and saying, these are the things we're basically committed to. These are the things we take to be most important. Here are the sorts of rights and principles and restrictions on what government can coercively do to its citizens that we take to be foundational to what we're doing here. Now, even if in practice, what is put in a charter can be contentious, at least it's there. And even if it's being ignored in some sense by members of the legislature or the judiciary, that in itself helps highlight the irregularity of certain sorts of activities. So if you have a piece of legislation which is, say, unconstitutional, the fact that it's unconstitutional is something that will probably make headlines. So if a judge makes a judgment that has to ignore a constitution or set it aside, or given that a judge has to provide reasons for their judgment, they have to somehow try to justify what they're doing. And they have to do it in light of this public declaration of the fundamental rights and values of the nation. So it helps really bring to light certain potentially underhanded things that might go on within a democracy by having those fundamental commitments put there in a very symbolic way. And Waluchow himself says, people within a given nation will likely point to their charter or Bill of Rights or Constitution or whatever it might be as something that they're proud of, something that they think, when they're thinking about their country and its political and legal system, this is something that people will point to as something that is important and helps define who they and we are as a community. So he thinks minimally we have these two good reasons to want to have a written charter, right? Helps us strike the right balance between flexibility and fixity, and it has this kind of symbolic value, which also comes from the accessibility of seeing these principles put down in a clear, fairly succinct form. This brings us around to section 8, the case for judicial review. Actually, let me get rid of that for now. So Waluchow presented 4 different points early on, 4 different questions he wanted to disentangle. What's the role of a charter, right? And he has offered a somewhat different view than he takes to be the standard view. The standard view is that it's this relatively fixed point. It's a way of having this pre-commitment to, okay, we're committed to these things and everything else we do is going to be on the basis of that. Says, well, if we have the living tree conception, we can take the charter as really a kind of starting point, as this articulation, the symbolic articulation of our fundamental commitments. But of course, we can be open to revision. We can be humble about it. We can admit that we don't have all the answers and maybe we got some things wrong. And so we can change them over time. The second question is whether or not it's worthwhile having a charter. This is really what we're looking at in the last section. Waluchow says, yes, it is a good thing to have a written charter like that, minimally for the 2 reasons we were just looking at. The third question is whether or not judicial review should be used as a means of actually applying the charter, about making sure that it has teeth, so to speak, that in practice it's used as a way to constrain what the legislature is able to do or what's even going on within other parts of the judiciary. We're going to see Waluchow's answer is yes, that's really the case he's making here. The fourth question was, how should that be done? If we think judicial review is something that should be done, what form should it take? Waluchow at least has a brief note in here in section 8. On page 310, he's got a footnote, and he says, you know, if we are committed to the living tree conception, minimally will be, as he puts it, we will be inclined to reject various forms of interpretive strategy, such as originalism, which presuppose fixed pre-commitments. So he doesn't have an awful lot more to say about question 4 in this piece, because that's really getting into the nitty-gritty sort of nuts and bolts of how's this going to work. But he says we can, just based on our question to answer, or our answer to question 1, what role should a charter have? How should it function? Well, it's the living tree conception. That tells us when we come to question 4, we can't have some sort of method, you know, how should we apply that charter? Well, it can't be something like originalism, which is really this view that there is some sort of fixed original meaning to what a charter or a constitution, when you have the different parts in it. What all those different parts mean? Well, it means whatever the people who wrote it originally meant when they wrote it. Waluchow says that sort of interpretive strategy really isn't going to work given the way we're conceiving of a charter and a living tree conception. So that's just a little bit in terms of question 4. Now let's come back to the case for the positive answer to question 3. Should there be judicial review? Waluchow's answer is yes. Here he engages pretty substantively with Waldron's argument. So this is where we really come to Waluchow picking on parts of Waldron's argument. Now, of course, Waluchow is citing a book that Waldron wrote. So we read a piece where Waldron's really summing up the argument he has. In the book, it's a much longer version. Waluchow's engaging with the book version. So there are some things here that don't exactly line up with what we saw in Waldron's case originally, but an awful lot of what Waluchow is saying here does apply back to Waldron's case, the case that we already saw. So Waluchow construes Waldron's position as really adopting the no reasonable disagreement standard. What does that mean? That means the standard for an acceptable view on you know, or an acceptable answer to the sorts of difficult questions we're raising is that there can't be reasonable disagreement on it, right? If there could be reasonable disagreement, then it's not the kind of thing that we can commit ourselves to as being the correct answer, because there's still reasonable disagreement. Other people could say, well, that's not the right answer, and here's why, and we'd have to say, oh, well, those are good reasons, and I'm not quite sure how to answer them yet. But although on the one hand, Waldron adopts this no reasonable disagreement standard, on the other hand, he also acknowledges that there is, and Waluchow puts it this way in several times in the last few pages, there's disagreement all the way down when it comes to political matters. And I mean political matters in the broad way, questions of political morality, including questions about law, limits of government power, and so on. So Waldron thinks there's disagreement all over the place. There's disagreement on everything. And in fact, we saw that. Waldron says not only is there disagreement on what sorts of rights should, say, be in a charter, there's disagreement on what kind of procedure we should use to settle disagreement when we have it. So what's Waldron's answer? You know, how do we deal with this? Well, his own favorite approach, Waldron's that is that just straightforward majoritarian democracy should be what we do. A kind of idealized legislature that acts according to the Enlightenment principles articulated by people like Kant and Rousseau. So you get together a group of representative persons, you know, elected by other people in a country, straightforward majority votes settle the issues, and we all reason in the best possible way. We have enlightened discussions, exchange good reasons. We try to pursue truth as best we can, come to a well-informed view about what's really best for the community, and then make a decision based on that. So this is really Waldron's solution. You know, we've got disagreement all the way down. We can't agree really on anything. So let's just settle for straightforward majoritarian democracy. But of course, as Waluchow points out, and he points to several other philosophers and theorists in these areas, there's a real tension there in Waldron's own view. So there's disagreement all the way down, and that disagreement extends to which approach we should take to settling things like disagreements and reasonable disagreements. So Waldron doesn't really have a foundation or a case for why using straightforward majoritarian democracy is the right way to go about settling our disagreement on these matters, rather than, say, setting up some sort of constitutional democracy that has a written charter in it. So, in a sense, what Waldron's doing is presupposing or almost begging the question about what sort of strategy we should use to settle our disagreements. So, Waluchow, the way he puts this together really in the first few pages here of section 8, he says, so really Waldron doesn't have a good case for why we should favor majoritarian democracy to some other way of going about settling these questions and debating these issues. He's really just picking his own favored way of doing it. Given that he's just picking his own favored way of doing it, in light of the fact that there's reasonable disagreement over which way is the best way to do this, then to be consistent, he has to allow that other people are free to presuppose their own favored procedure, right? Instead of straightforward majoritarian democracy, other people like, say, Waluchow or Rawls or whoever you might want, are free to instead articulate a different way to approach these sorts of questions, including some sort of constitutional arrangement. So there's really no basis or foundation here for Waldron to exclude other sorts of approaches, given his admission that there's reasonable disagreement all the way down on questions, not only the substantive questions of what sorts of rights we should have and how those should function in practice, but even on the procedural questions about how we should go about trying to answer those questions in the first place. So this first point of Waluchow's is really a critical one, that Waldron doesn't really have any grounds here to exclude alternative approaches to solving these sorts of issues, right? He can't just rule out judicial review as a live possibility beforehand. It needs to at least be explored. Now, when it comes to Waldron's own case, Waluchow says he's really trying to have his cake and eat it too, because what he does is he introduces a healthy dose of realism into thinking about what's going on when judges are trying to decide cases. So we're thinking about judicial review and judges sitting around and looking at a constitutional document, looking at a piece of legislation or something. There can be a lot of idealism there, that judges are these philosopher kings or, the best and brightest people, and they don't have biases or anything like that. Of course, Waldron draws our attention to some of these facts that people like critical theorists have brought up, that in fact, judges are human and they're fallible and they're biased, and in fact they come from particular, typically privileged backgrounds and so on, and all these things are going to be reflected in their judgments and their thinking. So Waldron introduces this healthy dose of realism into thinking about the judiciary and how judges actually do things in practice. And Waluchow says that's good. There is an awful lot of idealism that can float around when people are thinking about what judges are doing, so it's good to be realistic there. But unfortunately, what Waldron does in arguing for his own favorite solution is to reintroduce idealism when thinking about democratic politics. So rather than thinking about democratic politics and how majoritarian democracy functions in practice, Waldron instead introduces these idealized versions of them, drawing on things like Enlightenment thought, and really just bracketing or setting aside all of the actual problems these sorts of systems have. So what happens when we introduce that healthy dose of realism into our thinking about democratic politics, as well as a healthy dose of realism when thinking about what it is judges do and how much they can really be trusted or what their powers are really like? Now, when it comes to thinking about democratic politics, Waluchow points out several issues in this 8th section, so I'm not going to go through all of them. They should be largely familiar. I'll mention at least a few of them here, but it's worth looking at the section to pick up on them. So some of the issues in democratic politics, and he's thinking about the Canadian context largely here, not exclusively. There are just unequal distributions in power that result from different voting methods and from institutional designs. So if we go back for a moment just to what I was mentioning before, when you have a representative democracy like Canada, what's really going on? Well, the people of Canada come together and sort of in a moment, on voting day or sort of during that window voting is open, they express their views through a single decision of which representative for their area they should send to Parliament or the legislature, whatever precisely it is. And they have to do that in an all things considered way, right? You don't get to be able to vote on abortion rights and gun rights and freedom of speech rights and questions about taxes and this and that and right. You have all of these issues and then they get bundled together as packages and different parties present you their set of answers to them, right? If you're voting for, party X, what are you voting for? You're voting for, say, and so it depends on your area, right? Depends what sort of country you're in. But you're going to be voting for some kind of view on religious rights. You're going to be voting for some view on gun rights and abortion and taxes and foreign policy and education and healthcare and business and so many things all at once. But you only get one say. And even at that, you get one say over the course of different years. And even that say you get, that vote that you cast, depending on how it gets counted, if you're in a first past the post system, like we are here in Canada, each area, each district for voting, constituency, So say Lethbridge area, we've got one member of Parliament federally, and we've got 3 MLAs for the provincial legislature. Well, whoever gets the most votes for the area gets the seat. And it doesn't matter if they win by 1 vote or, 10,000, they win, They get the seat. And so what you can get in this sort of issue, and you get this in Canada, and you also get this in the United States, quite famously with the Electoral College down there, you can have a party that loses the popular vote. They don't get the most votes, from the people, but they get the most seats in the legislature, They actually get the control over making laws or something like that. So there's a divorce, there's a discrepancy there between what people actually do when they vote and what the outcomes are. And of course, there are other suggestions, things like proportional representation and so on, that can be used to try to fix those. But Waluchow's whole point here is that it's not like democratic politics is unproblematic to start with, There are these problems. Even if we set aside all those problems and we just look at how, say, House of Commons in Canada gets made up, well, you've got the whole party voting system, Votes get whipped. There's party discipline involved, for better or worse, and Waluchow thinks about that a little here, There are benefits to having party discipline and having party votes and forcing things through in a certain way. There are also disadvantages to it. In some ways, that's less democratic than always having free votes where people can vote with their conscience or according to what they think their constituents want them to vote, which can be 2 different things, Your constituents might want, I don't know, lower taxes, but you think as your representative, you actually think higher taxes are necessary to fund things like high quality education and healthcare and retirement and unemployment protections, So there are all of these questions around democratic politics and what's really the best way for us to organize ourselves when we're thinking about those. Now, Waluchow points to 6 particular problems on page 315. He really talks about ways in which things could be better in a democracy. So that's the way he outlines them. And I think for the sake of time, I'm not going to go through them. I thought about just reading them, but if you look on the right-hand column of the 315, he starts the paragraph with, "True, things would be different if, when votes are cast, the following were the case." And then he outlines 6 ways in which democratic politics, representative democracy like this could be better. And what do they really boil down to? Well, ways in which a democracy like ours would be better if our elected representatives acted in different ways. So if they would actually stand up and do what they think is right instead of caving to pressure from their party or their constituents or special interest groups or financial backers, right? And so on and so on. If they actually seriously thought about the issues instead of just engaging in mindless partisan politics and so on, right? So there are these variety of ways in which democratic politics is imperfect and in fact is not really that representative of the will of the people, which isn't to say it's not representative of the will of the people at all. I'm not saying that. I'm not saying it's some kind of sham and this is really a tyranny we're living in and something like that. But rather, it's just pointing out this realistic view that democratic politics are not perfect, right? Waldron's idealized version of them should not be used in deciding whether or not we should entrust the legislature with defining what our rights are, rather than allowing for a written charter to be enforced by judicial review. So once we are realistic about what's going on in democratic politics, we realize that there are serious problems there. Even after we're realistic about judges, realizing they're not ideal rational agents, they're not perfect angels or philosopher kings or anything like that, and they're going to make incorrect decisions and be biased and have problems, we have, of course, the question, which Waldron and some brought up as well, and it says what we have here is a question of what's more or less democratic. That's the way Waldron wanted to put it. And Waldron's answer is it's more democratic to allow for the legislature to deal with these issues than it is to allow judges to deal with these issues. Waluchow wants to frame that question a little bit differently. Let's say, okay, if we're being realistic, both about democratic politics and about what judges do and are likely to do, who is more likely to stand up to the sorts of political forces that can influence these sorts of decisions, right, in ways that they shouldn't be influenced? And Waluchow puts his money on judges. He says, look, even though judges might get things wrong, when it comes to questions of balancing rights and avoiding issues like the heat of the moment, being rushed, being at the whims of special interest groups or financial considerations or questions of party discipline and political careerism and so on, who's more likely to stand up to, as he puts it, the relevant political forces at play in deciding the contentious issues surrounding charter rights? He says judges, right? When you're looking to politicians in operating within democratic politics, what you have are people trying to get reelected. They're trying to keep their jobs, perhaps advance themselves through the party, get more powerful positions and so on. You get all those same issues going on in politics you get elsewhere as well. Sometimes even worse, perhaps. Judges are insulated from these sorts of considerations, largely, right? And this depends again on how that system works. If your judges are straightforwardly elected by people, they're probably going to be similarly influenced. But if you have a system where judges are actually getting appointed and then are relatively stable and secure in their positions, so they can make a judgment that might upset the sitting government of the day, it might even upset a majority of people, might upset interest groups, might upset groups with a lot of money and so on. Well, sure, they might still be swayed by some of those factors, right? What do the majority of people want? What do these interest groups want? And these sorts of things. They might still be swayed by that. That's going to factor into their reasoning. But they're also in that relatively free position to be able to sit back, take in all those reasons, and then really ask the tough questions of, so morally speaking, what should these rights be? Legally speaking, what is the best way for us to organize our community? Be something like a Dworkinian judge, right? Nobody can ever be Judge Hercules, but to sit back and say, what are really the best sorts of principles at play here? How do I best interpret this charter and apply it? How best do I interpret the debates that are going on in our community and about what's going to make our community best in the long run? So Waluchow thinks we need to frame the question a little bit differently, and then ultimately it's going to be judges rather than legislators who are in a better position to come to balanced decisions about these sorts of contentious issues and not be so swayed by heat of the moment considerations and issues, the sorts of issues that come with democratic politics. All right, so we've still got this question, if we do opt for judicial review, how should the judges entrusted with figuring out how these rights function in practice, how should this work, right? Couldn't we actually leave these sorts of tough decisions to legislatures, right? When we've got cases involving charter rights, rather than letting judges figure out how these things work, why not just let legislators deal with them directly by allowing these sorts of questions to run their way through the legislature instead of the courts, right? Couldn't we do that? Waldron's suggestion, right? Let the legislatures do this on their own. Well, Waluchow thinks this is just really impractical. So he thinks there's good reasons to actually favor the judgments of judges over the judgments of legislators in a democratic system like ours, in part because judges are more insulated and secure and so aren't as likely to be as influenced by other sorts of factors like keeping their job or being reelected or what have you. But also just more practically, legislatures are already very busy places. There's often a lot of disappointment in how much a party can get done, within say a 4-year period or something. Well, guess what? It's pretty busy work actually running a country or running a province. There are a lot of questions. There are lots of information that needs to be gathered, a lot of thinking that needs to be done, a lot of care needs to go into putting together legislation. And of course, legislation always has to be general in nature when we're making new legal rules that are going to apply to an indefinite number of cases, right? A lot of good thinking has to go into how best to formulate that. And of course, there's still always going to be problems. Now, when we're thinking about issues of constitutional rights, like what's going on in a charter, of course, there are the big headline-grabbing cases. How should this right written in the charter apply to this sort of big case that's going to have these huge ripple effects throughout all sorts of things? One view is, oh, well, let the legislature deal with that directly. Let the people's representatives directly have a say in how to do it. This is Waldron's suggestion, right? Effectively. But it's just impractical. Legislatures are already very busy. And even though there are those big headline-grabbing cases we might want them to weigh in on, Waluchow points out that there are so many other cases that involve things like charter rights or constitutional rights that just get dealt with quietly by the judicial system. If all cases involving something like a charter right in Canada were to go to the legislature, it would shut down. It just couldn't function anymore. It couldn't do the basic things it's supposed to do in terms of actually sitting, passing new pieces of legislation, doing all the sorts of things it normally does. It would just be completely overloaded with what's effectively now judicial work. And there's just, Waluchow doesn't quite put it this way, but I'm taking this from him. There's just really no clear procedure to determine which cases should be left to the courts and which should be decided by the legislature if we think at least some cases dealing with charter rights should go to the legislature. So right now the court system has a fairly good way of trying to figure this out, right? You go to trial, there might be a charter issue. Now, if it's dealt with in a way that seems pretty straightforward, it's unlikely to be an appeal or a successful appeal. If it's a big controversial issue, right, something that's really important, it's going to have a lot of impact that reaches well beyond the particular case or the sort of narrow set of cases in question. This is really a new way of interpreting the charter or applying it. Then your odds increase of going up to appeal court or the Supreme Court. And of course, once it gets up to the Supreme Court, well, you've got an awful lot of judges thinking about these things, drawing a lot of cases, hearing some pretty important arguments. You've got a forum in which all sorts of different groups can participate, right? They can sit in, so not only do the people sort of at the trial necessarily sit in, other groups can submit things to be considered by the court and so on. And then of course, you can always have the legislature sort of chiming back in as well. Once the courts have made some kind of decision, well, the legislature can think about, are there different ways they want to change statutes? Do they want to seek a change in the charter or so on? These are always open possibilities. So the current system of having judicial review based on something like a written charter is minimally practical. It's functional. It helps let a country run rather than submitting everything back to the legislature. In fact, Waluchow points to France and the revolutionary, you think about the French Revolution. Where is he saying this? On page 317, he's talking about, you know, what's actually put into, French law in 1790, which is that every time courts need to interpret something as law, they go back to the legislature. So anytime there's a big interpretive question, they have to go back to the legislature to ask the legislature to tell them how they should interpret things. And Waluchow says, look, the French didn't even do that, right? And they were very revolutionary in spirit, and then in practice they were trying to make things as democratic as possible. And it's just not practical. Waluchow says, I don't know of any country that actually does this. It's just not going to work. So we've got some good theoretical reason, right? Once we're being realistic both about the prospects of what judges are going to do and what legislators do, Waluchow says, all things considered, I think judges are going to do a better job than legislators. And of course, you might disagree and still say, no, the legislators really should do it either for practical or theoretical reasons. But just practically, it's unlikely that legislators will be able to actually do what Waldron wants them to do, right? They just don't have the time. You would, in effect, have to probably set up some new special part of the legislature dealing with law. We might call it, oh, I don't know, a judiciary, right? Part of the legal system, a different branch of government that deals specifically with questions of interpreting and applying the law rather than creating new law. Like this, in fact, what's already going on in a common law system. You've got a separation of powers, right? Of course, they intersect with each other, but they each have a different specialized domain. Okay, now there's another question. Are the decision-making contexts of the judiciary and the legislature identical? This was something Waldron was thinking about a little, and Waluchow was considering that here. Now, if in fact their decision-making contexts are identical, then arguably the legislature is the better place to make these sorts of decisions about what our rights are and how they should function in practice rather than the judiciary, precisely because the legislature is more democratic and better represents the will of the people in a country, right? So if the decision-making contexts are identical, then, as Waldron argues, it's preferable to let the legislature make these sorts of decisions rather than the judiciary because it's just more democratic. Oh, right, this point, so I got ahead of myself, I'm sorry. Now, Waluchow thinks the decision-making contexts are not identical. So he answers this in the negative, right? This is a real question. Are the decision-making contexts identical? If they are, it seems like we should favor the legislature. But they aren't identical, right? And this is something I've already mentioned here. Legislatures are forced to use, as Waluchow puts it, the blunt instrument of general legislation in exercising their power. They have to think in very general terms. When people are in a particular sort of situation, what should or shouldn't they be allowed to do? Right? What sorts of consequences should come from doing an action this way versus that way, or whatever it is exactly. So legislators and acting in legislatures are, in some sense, making very general exercises of their power, right? They don't get to apply the law to very particular situations. And of course, we could argue, well, maybe they should, thinking back to the previous slide, but that just doesn't seem practically possible. So in effect, what they're doing are always these passing general pieces of legislation, creating laws that are very general in nature. When it comes down to the actual application of the law in practice, when presented with a particular sort of case, what sort of law applies, what does it tell us, is that the right way to think about it, what does the precedent say, so on and so forth. This is exactly what a common law judiciary engages in. And arguably, a common law judiciary is a good thing, precisely because it gets to reason in a case-by-case way. So it takes each case, looks at it, looks at what the facts are, thinks about what the laws are, right? What are the various statutes? What are the pieces of legislation? What's in the charter? So on and so forth. What precedent-setting decisions have been made in the past? What parts out of all of that, all those sources of law, what applies here? What sort of case is this? And what do those previous things all tell me? Should there be a distinction made here, right? In fact, is this case different from previous cases, so some sort of previous precedent doesn't apply? Is this case different somehow from what that piece of legislation is trying to govern? does this case actually involve a charter right or not? Right? So there are all these questions of fact that judges have to think about. They can also then make critical use of precedent, right? Even if they look at the case, they say, well, this case is relevantly similar to these other cases, and this precedent should apply, and there's this charter right involved, and so on. Judges can still make what's often a controversial decision of trying to overturn precedent in some sense. Say, I know this is what happened in the past, but in light of what's happened in the meantime, right, say the precedent's 100 years old and there hasn't been a similar case or something, they might say, well, I'm not going to apply it this time. And it's probably going to be grounds for appeal, right? Whoever is not getting favored by this decision is probably going to say, I did something wrong by not applying it, and so it's probably going to work its way up the sort of judicial hierarchy, right? They're going to want to have other judges weigh in about whether or not this was really the right call, but it's the one I'm going to make, right? So in the common law system, judges have quite a bit of power. And in using that power, they get to reason in a much more precise way than legislators are able to do. And that's not to somehow say judges are better than legislators, right? It's not to say that legislators are stupid and judges are brilliant and this sort of thing. Again, that seems to be allowing this kind of idealization to creep back in. Rather, they're just engaged in different sorts of reasoning activities. Legislatures and the legislators within it need to think in very general terms. How should our community be governed overall? How should these laws read, right? In general, how should things be settled and so on. When it comes to judges, they're thinking about not only in those terms and thinking about what legislatures have done, but they're also thinking then in sort of practical concrete terms. Okay, in this case, I've got all these factors influencing my decision, but what should happen here, right? Even if there is a particular kind of verdict or something, judges often, though not always, have some sort of discretion they can use in terms of sentencing and so on. So there's just sort of different activities going on between legislatures and the judiciary. And Waluchow ultimately thinks that's a good thing, right? There's room here for judicial review in trying to tease out in these particular case-by-case examples what these rights really mean and how they should function in practice. And that's a valuable thing to keep, one that we shouldn't try to kick off back to legislatures, which are already very busy and which themselves are, as I've at least tried to argue here, not always accountable in that democratic kind of way, idealized democratic kind of way, where people can always, vote out legislators that they think have handled rights issues wrongly. Because often people might have that view. They might say, well, I voted for Party X last time, and I think they really screwed up this issue of rights. But particularly if those rights really concern a minority, they don't have some sort of negative impact on the individual voting. And all other things considered, the person thinks it's still in their interest to vote for the same party again. Even if they would like that particular issue of rights to be solved, and they think there really is perhaps a moral issue involved here, they might still wind up voting for the same party, given all of the other questions that are being answered by that single vote. Right? They say, well, look, I know they treated that minority group wrongly by doing this sort of thing, but I only get one vote, and I think all the other parties would do a far worse job, all things considered, than this one, so I'm going to vote for them again. Right? And of course, you can write to your representative or talk to them or pick up the phone or something like that and tell them, I think you did wrong here. And so there is some room there for the democratic process to work, even though the voting might not be sort of fully effective in this sort of way. But there's still that question. The legislature is pretty busy. What's it going to take for them to reopen this issue? And if they don't think there's a genuine prospect of them losing an election because of how they handled some particular issue, are they really going to be motivated to do something about it? And just how motivated will everyday people be to spend their time and energy advocating for the rights of other people if, in fact, whether or not those rights are upheld, it doesn't actually affect those people in their day-to-day lives? Right? And this isn't to somehow throw dirt on the average citizen in a democracy. I'm just trying to, with Waluchow here, introduce that realism to how democratic politics work. People are busy, right? People are busy with their families and their day-to-day lives and their jobs and all sorts of things, right? So can average people be reasonably expected to go out of their way to advocate on behalf of others all the time? Now, we might want to actually answer yes to that question. Maybe, right? Maybe. And of course, there seems to be something at least sort of morally good, if not even politically good, about advocating for the rights of other people, certainly. But I'm just pointing to these questions. If we're being realistic, how often do these sorts of things happen? And our legislature is going to be better, right? And this Waldron sort of put it this way, and Waluchow is putting it this way too. It's really a question of, is it better to let judges or legislators deal directly with these questions about what exactly the rights are and what they mean in practice? Waldron argued it's really better for the legislature. Here, Waluchow has argued in favor instead of the judiciary for really all the reasons we've outlined here. Okay, there's one final point Waluchow wants to address, and this was something that we saw in Waldron's piece as well. What about the level of public debate? Now, we saw this in Waldron. Waluchow gives us a version of this as well. Waldron argues that the level of public debate is really reduced by written charters because it produces a kind of fixation on verbal formulations instead of issues, right? So one that Waluchow points out is, say, when dealing with questions of freedom of expression and what sorts of expressive acts should be protected in the public sphere. So within the United States, what sorts of expressive acts or speech acts should be protected by law? So even when the majority of people don't want a certain kind of expressive act taking place, for instance, flag burning or nude dancing or something like that, should it be protected? Should the minority rights to express themselves in a certain sort of way that goes against the majority view, should it be protected, legally speaking? Or should the majority be able to get together and pass a law and say, no, you're not allowed to burn the flag anymore, or dance nude, or whatever it is? Well, in the United States context, what you get are a lot of arguments about what counts as speech, because of course the First Amendment right, freedom of speech, will not be infringed. The big question then is, well, what counts as speech? Because if it counts as speech, then there can't be a law that restricts it. So if nude dancing or flag burning is a kind of speech, then it's constitutionally protected. It seems really weird to call nude dancing or flag burning a kind of speech. There's no talking going on there, at least not necessarily, right? So it seems weird to call it speech. But say in Canada, we instead opt for free expression. And of course, you can have an expressive act that itself is not a form of speech, right? It's dancing or kind of physical activity or something like that, making music, say. So Waldron's point is really that public debate gets sort of narrowed and put on these weird little paths by having a charter or some kind of written constitutional document entrenching rights, because then the debate starts surrounding what counts as what, right? How things were put, how the wording was done, and the debate starts to circle really around that, instead of the larger question about what sorts of rights should we have for freedom of expression, and what should we think people should be able to do even when most other people don't think they should be able to do it, right? The real substantive issues instead. Waluchow disagrees here as well, right? And this is my way of putting it, but I think it captures what Waluchow is going after here. The careful reasoning of judges in a common law setting, combined with the clarity of a written charter, can actually help heighten the level of public debate by sharpening certain points and seeding public discussion. So say, just sticking with questions of, say, freedom of speech, freedom of expression sound like good things, right? And I think almost all of us can agree to that. In fact, this is one of Waluchow's points, right? I think we can all more or less agree that some kind of protection for free speech, free expression is a good thing to have in a free liberal society. The government shouldn't be telling us what we can and can't say for the most part, right? It shouldn't be the case that we have some sort of tyrannical government that gets to tell us what sorts of things we're allowed to say and what sorts of things we're not allowed to say. We should be allowed to say our elected representatives are idiots or doing something wrong, right? Or that there's a problem with their moral character or something like that. We should be allowed to say all kinds of things, right, legally. Now, that sounds good. What about hate speech, right? In practice, does the right to free expression also guarantee the right of a hate group to, say, parade downtown Lethbridge burning effigies, holding up, racist slogans and things, advocating for genocide and so on, right? Now, in general, if you put to me the general principle, freedom of expression should be protected, I'll say, yeah, it should. And you say, does that include things like hate speech? Should we defend that kind of practice? I don't think so, right? Now, am I sure? No, it's a tricky issue, right? I think there are good reasons not to allow it. Then again, I've also heard some good reasons to potentially allow, right? Or at least they're potentially good reasons to allow. So what should we do? Should we or shouldn't we allow hate speech to happen in a public setting, right? Or versus, say, a private setting? I'm far less confident about my answer to that question than I am my general answer to the question, should free expression be protected? Yeah, I think free expression should be protected, but should hate speech in public be protected? I don't think so. Now, in the United States, hate speech is basically protected. It counts as a form of speech, so it's protected by the First Amendment. Here in Canada, it's not. There's the Keegstra decision. There's been some other decisions since, which draw a line between protecting free expression sort of generally from protecting hate speech, and it actually says, no, we can disallow hate speech. We can coercively stop people from engaging in that kind of behavior. Why? What are the reasons? So if you actually look at the Keegstra decision written by, there's a dissenting opinion in there. The majority opinion was written by Chief Justice Dixon, and he articulates some, I think, very good reasons for why hate speech shouldn't be allowed. In fact, I've drawn on them in some of my work. I think Keegstra had some really good ideas there. In fact, he's drawing on, at least to some degree, John Stuart Mill on questions about the harm principle. What's going on in the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms? What's the whole idea of a democratic society? How does that inform how we should think about free expression? Right? It's not like, even though we don't want to be idealists about judges and have unrealistic expectations about what they do, if we think about it just in a very sort of basic way, they are professionals in the sense that they are trained, right? They have a very special set of knowledge and a special set of skills. They have been trained and have extensive experience in dealing with the legal system and how that engages with society at large and politics more generally. And they take time. They have time and energy to spend on thinking about these difficult issues. Does that guarantee they get them right? No. But who am I more likely to listen to, and who do I think just prima facie is likely to come up with the best sorts of reasons available for or against any particular view? Presumably the sort of people who put time and energy into trying to do that. Right? Look, when it comes to getting my car working right, I go to a mechanic because they spend their time and energy on cars and they know a lot about them. If I've got questions about taxes, I go to people who deal with taxes. Right? We do this sort of thing all the time. If I have questions about farming, I'll go to a farmer. If I have questions about gardening, I'll go to a gardener, right? We, generally speaking, seek people who have specialized knowledge in an area when we've got questions we want to settle in that area. Now, as we saw earlier with Waldron, he says, look, often when it comes to things like political theory, political philosophy, thinking about law and these important questions, we should expect any of the answers to be the sorts of answers that can be understood by most people within the society, right? It shouldn't be some sort of arcane, bizarre theorizing that's just completely divorced from what real people think and value and so on. So, of course, there's that domain of public reason. And judges should be producing reasons that are public in that sense, that other people can read and think about and say, yeah, that makes sense. I see what's going on there. But it's also going to be sophisticated in the way that if we're just sort of doing this sort of reasoning in our spare time or just sort of articulating what we happen to feel on some kind of subject, we're probably not going to have the best reasons available on the subject sitting right there for us. So actually having a written charter which puts out some certain basic principles that are important, that's a very useful thing. It's useful symbolically. It's also useful practically. People can go look at it and read it and think about it. Actually having judges make decisions and then have to articulate reasons in favor of that decision, why they decided the way they do, can actually help public debate, right? Even if not all people have the time to read through all those decisions, the kinds of reasoning going on there can be digested and distributed by media or other kinds of sources, right? They can get, in some sense, digested and then become part of that public discourse. So in fact, Waluchow thinks having judicial review itself can actually help heighten the level of public discourse rather than lower it the way Waldron thinks it might. So that takes us through the end of our last piece of the term. I hope you've enjoyed going through this course as much as I have. It's been very interesting, I think. I hope you've enjoyed the readings and the classes. I hope the videos have been at least acceptable. If they've been a little less exciting, I've certainly missed some of the excellent questions that were raised as I was going through material in the classes. I hope you're all dealing with this transition as well as could be expected. If you've got any final questions or comments or anything like that, please feel free to get a hold of me. I'll be circulating a little bit more information on the final exam later this week. I'm still thinking about exactly what to do there. I don't have detailed study guides on these last two pieces. Stay tuned about that. Overall, I think this has been a great course, and it's been my great pleasure teaching all of you. And I know Sean has also very enjoyed this course very much. He's also talked about some of the great conversations he's had and wonderful things he's overheard and some of the wonderful papers he's read by some of you. So we both enjoyed having you all very much. Well, one last request, please do a course evaluation. I know it's a very, very busy time of year, but it'd be very helpful for me if you could take at least a few moments just to do one online and sort of tick off the boxes. All I ask is that you be honest, right? If you've got critical feedback, share it. If there's something you really liked about the course, let me know. If there's something you didn't like about the course, let me know. Ideally, if there's something you didn't like, tell me how it could be better, right? Maybe you can't think of a way it could be better. Well, that's fine, just to tell me what you think could have improvement, right? What was the weakest area or set of areas in the course, right? The course material, me, my presentation, delivery, whatever it might be. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So I hope you're all doing very well. I'll be working on those second papers and trying to get them back to you by next week before the exam. So I hope you're all doing great and that you're sorry, just sort of trailed off there. I hope you're all doing as well as possible, and I hope you've enjoyed the course. Best of luck to all of you in the future, and I'll be in touch, at least in writing, in the not too distant future as well. So until we meet again, bye for now.